The territory of southwestern Kansas kept its silences the way a closed fist keeps a stone. In the autumn of 1887, in a dust-soured settlement called Arroyo Plata that the railroad had bypassed and the county had quietly forgotten, a young woman paid $2 for a building that 3 other bidders had refused at one. Her name was Cora Vess. She was 26 years old, the daughter and sole apprentice of a master stonemason who had died of a fever the previous spring, leaving her his tools, his notebooks, and the education that formal institutions had no intention of providing to a woman. She had spent the summer settling his debts, a task that took 3 months and most of the small reserve he had kept in a tin box under his workbench, and the early autumn traveling west by rail and then by rented wagon, looking for something her father had always called a working situation, meaning a place where the structures were old enough to need someone who understood them, and where nobody had yet thought to bring one in. What she found instead was an auction notice pinned to a telegraph pole outside a general store, and the general store's owner, a wide, straight-backed woman named Addie Crane, who told her without being asked that the building being sold had been a saloon once, that 3 separate families had tried to make it something else, and that none of them had lasted more than a season. Cora stood with Addie Crane outside the building on the morning of the auction and looked at it for a long time without speaking. The structure was built of ochre sandstone blocks, locally quarried from the small canyon east of town, and even under 30 years of weather and neglect, the stonework was evident to anyone who had been taught to see it. The blocks were cut true and set in level courses with a precision that stood apart from the slapped-up frame buildings on either side. The mortar joints were narrow and even. The quoin corners were dressed cleanly. Whoever had built this building in 1856 had known the material and respected it, and the material had repaid that respect by standing. Whatever else the saloon had been, someone had built it to last. The auctioneer was a rangy man named Hobbs, who ran the proceedings from the back of a buckboard, with the mild, practiced disinterest of a man who expected nothing to surprise him. When the bidding opened and Cora raised her hand at $2, he looked at her the way one looks at a child who has wandered into the wrong room. The 2 men who had briefly bid against each other at $1 let the silence settle and did not trouble to bid again. A 3rd man near the back, a drover in a coat that had once been brown, said loud enough for the street to hear that the county might as well deed the property to a fence post and save the ink. There was a scattered sound from the small crowd that might have been laughter. Hobbs gavelled it at $2 and handed Cora a deed so new it smelled of ink. She did not smile. She folded the deed, put it in the inside breast pocket of her coat, and went back to looking at the building. She stood there long enough that Addie Crane, who had remained beside her, glanced over once and said nothing, and that nothing was its own form of respect. If you have ever watched a craftsperson study a problem before they touch it, you know the particular stillness that comes over them. It is not uncertainty. It is inventory. Cora Vess stood on the packed dirt of Arroyo Plata's single commercial street and took inventory of every course of stone she could see, working from the foundation line up to the eave, reading the building the way her father had taught her, which was to say not as a sum of surfaces but as an argument made in 3 dimensions. What she read made the $2 feel, in a way she could not yet put into words, like the most considered purchase of her life. Her father, Bernard Vess, had taught her to read stone the way a doctor reads a patient. You looked at the surface, yes, but what you were always really asking was, what was behind it? Stone could be moved, shored, removed, replaced. Stone could hide things that wood and plaster could not, because stone was permanent in a way those materials were not, and because the people who laid it trusted it with what they needed kept. He had said this to her first in the context of renovations, of finding old chimneys and hidden structural walls in buildings that had been added onto without care. But the principle extended further than that, and he had made sure she understood the full reach of it. If you sealed something behind stone and mortared it closed, the stone would remember it long after you were gone. Longer, certainly, than any paper filing, any county clerk's note, any court record that could be lost or misdirected or quietly suppressed. The building had two main rooms. The front room was where the bar had stood, and the rough timber bar was still there, warped and gray with age, its surface mapped with rings from glasses set down over 3 decades and never wiped. 3 stools remained, having lost their seats, and a fly-specked shelf along the back wall still held 3 bottles, so empty and so long in place that the glass had taken on the faint amber iridescence that glass acquires after years of standing in indirect sun. The floor was packed earth with a partial plank covering near the bar. The planks warped and 2 of them rotted through. Cora walked it carefully, testing each board before she committed her weight. The rear room was a storage and back office space, low-ceilinged and dark, with a single window boarded over from the inside, with planks nailed in such haste that 2 of the nails had bent rather than set. There was debris on the floor, collapsed shelving, the remains of a crate, and a layer of the fine red dust that southwestern Kansas produced in such quantity that it found its way into sealed spaces through joints and cracks you could not have located with a lamp. Cora moved the debris methodically to one side and spent the better part of the morning in the rear room. The rear room's north wall was wrong. She knew it within minutes of sweeping the baseboard clear. The wall was the full thickness of exterior stonework, 18 inches deep, which was correct for the building's construction period and region. But the interior face of the wall was slightly irregular in a way that exterior stone was not, unless interior stone had been added to it later, laid against the existing face and mortared over to appear continuous. Her father had shown her this distinction on a renovation project in Dodge City 2 years before his death, when they had opened an old merchant's storage room and found that someone had built a false interior face. The merchant had died before telling his heirs where he had put the deed to a parcel of land in Missouri. The stone had remembered it for 23 years, patient and indifferent, holding its secret against the possibility that someone with the right knowledge would eventually come looking. Here the irregularity ran approximately 4 feet wide and 7 feet tall, floor to near ceiling, in the center of the north wall. The mortar at the edges of this section was newer than the surrounding courses by what her father's notebooks would have let her estimate at 15 to 20 years, meaning it had been laid sometime in the late 1860s or early 1870s. The stones themselves, while the same ochre sandstone as the rest, had the small variations in color saturation that came from being cut and cured at a different time. A slightly cooler gray undertone beneath the ochre surface, the mark of stone that had spent less time in the weather before being laid. This section had been added, not repaired, not patched. Added deliberately by someone who wanted what was behind it to stay behind it. Someone had bricked something in. She did not start work that day. She went back to the general store, bought what provisions she could afford from the $2 and some odd cents remaining in her coat pocket, and asked Addie Crane if she might sleep in the building beginning that night. Addie looked at her with an expression that held more assessment than pity, and said she could, and then said, without being asked, that she ought to know 2 things about the property before she committed to it. The first thing was that the saloon had been built in 1856 by a man named Rufus Galt, who had operated it through the tail end of the trail drive years and had vanished in the winter of 1871 without formal notice, leaving behind a modest reputation for watered whiskey and a more substantial one for receiving money that did not belong to him. Nobody had looked very hard for Rufus Galt. He had been the sort of man whose absence made the community marginally more comfortable than his presence had, and the county had been occupied with other concerns. The second thing was that a United States Marshal named De Vere had come through Arroyo Plata in 1873 looking for a strongbox. The strongbox, De Vere had told anyone who would listen, had contained the combined land claim payments of 37 homesteader families from the counties along the Cimarron River, collected by an agent of the Western Claims and Settlement Company, who had then handed the funds to Rufus Galt for reasons the marshal had not been able to formally establish before Galt vanished. The marshal had searched the saloon from floor to eave and found nothing. He had pried up floorboards, knocked on walls, and interrogated the 3 families who had lived in the building after Galt left. When he left town, he told the county clerk that the strongbox was probably a myth, that it had likely never contained what the families believed, and that the matter was administratively closed. The county clerk, whose name appeared on the deed to 2 of those same homestead parcels in a clerical capacity that was not quite legal and had never been quite questioned, wrote this down and filed it. Addie Crane delivered both pieces of information in the same measured, unsentimental voice, the way a person delivers something they have held for a long time and are not certain what to do with. When she finished, she set her hands flat on the counter and looked at Cora. Cora thanked her and asked where she could find the county recorder's office. The county recorder was a dry, meticulous man named Fitch, who had held the position for 12 years and treated every request for documents with the grudging hospitality of a man who knows that people only ever want what he has, never him. He was, nonetheless, thorough, and thoroughness was what Cora needed. When she explained what she was looking for, using precise language and asking only for the specific record set, he produced, after 20 minutes of deliberate searching, the original land claim records for the Cimarron homesteads from 1870. He had them because no one had ever formally closed the inquiry, only the marshal's informal note, and the paper existed independent of what the note said. 37 families. 37 sets of filings with the Territorial Land Office, each showing a payment made to an agent of the Western Claims and Settlement Company, dated between August and November of 1870. Each filing bore the agent's name, Clarence Ooft. Each noted the sum paid, ranging from $80 for a quarter section to $140 for a full. Each was stamped with the company's seal, which was an eagle above a balanced scale, which Cora found grimly appropriate under the circumstances. No corresponding transfers of title appeared in the subsequent record. 37 families who had paid for their land and received nothing, and who had, in the years since, either surrendered their claims under pressure, died, or scattered. One entry at the bottom of the stack was different from the others. It was a single page, not a filed claim, but a letter, addressed to the county clerk of the time and signed by a man named Hector Mares, who described himself as a farmer along the Cimarron, with a parcel registered under his wife's name, Luz Mares. The letter, written in careful Spanish-influenced English with the slightly formal construction of a man writing in his second language on a matter of some gravity, stated that Hector Mares had seen the company agent hand a locked iron box to Rufus Galt at the saloon on the evening of November the 14th, 1870. He had been in the alley behind the building collecting a harness he had left there for mending. He had seen Galt take the box inside through the rear door. He had watched the rear door for another hour and seen no one carry it out. The county clerk of the time had written in pencil along the upper margin of the letter, "Witness unreliable, no further action." Cora read the margin note twice. She was not certain whether the pencil note reflected a genuine assessment of Hector Maris's credibility or a more convenient one, But she knew that the note had been written by a man whose name appeared on 2 homestead parcels in a questionable clerical capacity, and that knowledge sat at the back of her mind like a stone set slightly out of plumb. She asked Fitch to make her a certified copy of the letter and paid him the 6 cents it cost. He did not ask why she wanted it. She began work on the north wall of the rear room the following morning. Her father had left her 3 cold chisels of different widths, 2 hammers of different weights, a pointing trowel, a straight-edge rule graduated in 1/16 of an inch, and 6 notebooks dense with observations on the properties of regional stone, mortar composition, structural load distribution, and the particular behaviors of lime-based mortars as they aged. She had supplemented these with a pry bar and a mason's line bought in the last town, with money she had been holding for a purpose she had not yet defined. The tools were in the condition of tools that had been used daily and cared for nightly. The steel bright where it met material and dark with penetrating oil everywhere else. She laid them out on the floor of the rear room in the order she expected to use them and looked at the wall for a while before she picked up anything. This was also something her father had taught her. The time you spend before you start is never wasted. A wall that has stood for 16 years will stand another hour while you think. If you begin wrong, you carry the wrongness through every course you remove, and you will not recover it. Begin with understanding. The mortar in the false section was a lime and sand mix, period correct for the early 1870s, and it had cured hard over 16 years of dry Kansas heat and cold. Working, it was slow. She used the lighter hammer and the narrowest chisel to open the perimeter joints, cutting along the seam where the new section met the original stonework, careful not to disturb the flanking courses that were original to the 1856 construction. Her father had been categorical about this. When you open something a prior hand built, you are in conversation with them, and the rules of that conversation were the rules of any other, which was to say you listened before you spoke, and you did not damage what you did not need to move. She worked for 3 days. The first day she cleared the mortar from the perimeter joints of the false section and confirmed its dimensions precisely. 4 feet and 3 inches wide, 6 feet and 8 inches tall, a space large enough to stand in. She also confirmed, by examining the mortar's color and texture under the lantern at different angles, that the entire section had been laid in a single sustained effort by someone working quickly. The joints were even but not meticulous, the stones seated soundly but not dressed as carefully as the surrounding courses. Someone had built this section not to be permanent architecture but to be closed. The difference was in the intention, and stone preserved intentions as faithfully as it preserved everything else. The second day she removed the first course of stones from the bottom of the section, 1 block at a time, tapping the joints free and lifting each block out and setting it on the floor to her right in the order it had come from the wall. She did this so that the stones could be returned to exactly their prior positions if need be, though she did not expect that to be necessary. The air that came out from behind the newly opened base was old and dry, and held the specific mineral coldness of sealed stone, the temperature that the stone had held undisturbed since Rufus Galt had mortared the last course in place and walked away from whatever he had locked inside. She recognized the smell not with alarm, but with the grave particular attention her father had taught her to bring to the moment a wall opened. When a wall opened, what came out first was what it had been keeping. On the morning of the 3rd day, with 4 courses removed and a rough opening at knee height in the lower portion of the false section, she brought her lantern close to the gap and looked inside. The alcove behind the wall was approximately 4 feet deep from the false face to the original exterior stone. Its floor was the same packed earth and rubble that made up the building's foundation base. There was a wooden shelf across the back wall, 2 boards wide and running the full width of the alcove, split along its length and bowing with the weight of years, the wood gone gray and splintered. The shelf had been constructed to hold something specific at a specific height. Not a general storage shelf, but a purpose-built rest. On the shelf, sitting with the settled permanence of something that had not been touched or moved in 16 years, was an iron strongbox. It was roughly 14 inches long and 10 inches wide, and perhaps 8 inches deep, and it was secured with a padlock the size of a man's fist. The iron oxidized to a dark reddish brown but intact, the shackle still closed through the hasp. The box itself was marked along its top edge with 2 bands of what had once been painted decoration, now reduced to a series of irregular rust-colored patches against the dark iron body, and its 4 corners were reinforced with heavier cast-iron brackets, the kind of hardware used on commercial cash and document boxes of the 1860s. It was clearly the product of a foundry and not a local blacksmith. It had been made to secure things of value, and it had been doing exactly that, unasked and unacknowledged, for 16 years. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a while before she reached for anything. Then she reached into her coat for the certified copy of Hector Maris's letter, unfolded it, and read it once more in the lantern light, her lips not moving. An iron box, the man had written, carried by the company agent, handed to Rufus Galt at the rear door of the saloon on the evening of November the 14th, 1870. Cora looked from the letter to the box and back to the letter and folded it carefully. The marshal had called this a myth. She spent the balance of the morning removing enough of the wall to bring the box out without dropping it, which meant clearing 2 more courses so that she could grip it properly and lift from a stable stance. The box was heavier than its dimensions suggested, as iron commercial strongboxes of the period were, built to resist both the elements and determined effort. She set it on the floor of the rear room and crouched beside it and examined the padlock. It was a lever tumbler mechanism, common in commercial iron goods manufactured in the eastern foundries during the 1860s and distributed westward through hardware merchants and general stores. Her father had shown her the working principle of these locks in the context of a project they had undertaken together in his last healthy year, salvaging a locked document chest from a demolished courthouse annex, not because he expected her to pick locks, but because his philosophy of the craft was that understanding how a thing was made was prerequisite to working with it honestly, rather than against it by force. She examined the hasp where it met the iron lid. The hasp was attached to the lid's edge by 4 wood screws, threaded through iron sleeves, original hardware, and the screws showed the same reddish oxidation as the surrounding iron. They had not been touched since the box was locked and set on that shelf. She found the flat-blade screwdriver among her father's tools, worked each screw free carefully so the oxidized threads would not strip, and lifted the hasp away from the lid. The padlock came with it, still closed, now irrelevant. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had dried and cracked along its folded edges but had otherwise held, was a bundle of papers. Beneath the papers, loose on the iron floor of the box, were a number of coins. She did not count the coins yet. She lifted the oilcloth bundle into the lantern light and unfolded it and began to read. The papers were receipts, 37 of them, each bearing the name and parcel description of a homesteader family and the amount paid, signed in a clear mercantile hand as Clarence Oft, agent of the Western Claims and Settlement Company. Each receipt was dated between August and November of 1870. The dates sequential across the set in the order Oft had apparently collected them, working up the Cimarron Valley from east to west. Each was stamped with the company's seal. Each was, in the language and form of territorial land office procedure, a fully valid proof of payment that ought to have accompanied a deed transfer. Beneath the receipts, folded separately and sealed with a wax wafer that had cracked but not dissolved, was a single page in a different hand, a more educated one. The letters formed with the flourished certainty of a man accustomed to correspondence that would be acted upon. It was a letter from the regional director of the Western Claims and Settlement Company to Clarence Alft, dated October the 3rd, 1870. It instructed Alft to collect the payments from the Cimarron homesteaders, to issue receipts as proof of collection, and to deliver the collected funds in their entirety to a named account at the First Commercial Bank of Kansas City. The letter named the account number. It named the specific sum expected, and it contained in its third paragraph a sentence that was careful and indirect in the manner of a man who knew what he was ordering but preferred not to say it plainly, that the issuance of deed transfers would be managed centrally by the company's legal office following review, with timing at the company's discretion. The account was registered in the name of Ellis Galt, brother of Rufus. The company had never intended to transfer those titles. They had taken the money and planned to let the filings lapse into administrative limbo until the homesteaders either gave up or died. Rufus Galt, by keeping the Strongbox rather than delivering it as instructed, had either been running his own theft alongside the company's larger one, or had in some way she could not fully determine from these documents alone, preserved by accident or design, the single most damning proof that the fraud had been systematic and deliberate. The receipts established that 37 families had paid. The director's letter established that the company never intended to honor those payments. Together, they were not an accusation. They were a record. She sat on the floor of the rear room of the saloon in Arroyo Plata for a long time with the papers arranged before her and the empty box beside her and the opened alcove in the north wall behind her, the lantern's light catching the dust she had raised still drifting in the cold air. The coins, when she counted them, totaled $41 in silver and gold. She did not consider the coins hers. Addie Crane was the first person she told. She came into the general store the following morning before the other customers arrived and laid the papers out on the counter in their groups, receipts in order, director's letter to one side, and let Addie read them without speaking. Addie read slowly and without expression, turning each page with the careful deliberateness of a person who understands that what they are holding is significant and wants to understand it fully before they say anything about it. When she finished the last page, she stood very still for a moment, with her hands resting flat on the counter, and looked at the wall above the door. Hector Maris had a grandson, Addie said at last, her voice level. He runs the feed store in Elkhart. His name is Thomas. There was a pause. There is also a woman in Liberal, Addie continued, named Cordelia Farrow. She is 81 years old, and she is the surviving daughter of a family named in those records. I know this because her daughter came through here last summer and mentioned her mother's age and her mother's habit of keeping, among her few possessions, a copy of a land claim filing that had never come to anything. Cora asked if there was a telegraph office in Arroyo Plata. There was not. There was one at the rail stop 12 miles east, at a hamlet called Cedar Draw. She made the 12 miles that afternoon and sent 3 telegrams. The first went to Thomas Maris at Elkhart. The second went to Cordelia Farrow at Liberal. The third went to the superintendent of claims at the Territorial Land Office in Topeka, addressed formally and describing in brief, specific language what she had found, where it was, and what documentation it constituted. She did not send a telegram to the county marshal, the successor of the man who had called this a myth. She did not send one to any figure of local authority. She sent it to Topeka because Topeka was at a remove from whatever local arrangements had allowed a pencil note to serve as the closing of an open fraud. She received 2 replies by the following morning. Thomas Mares arrived 4 days later in a wagon that also carried his older sister and a woman Cora took to be his wife, all 3 dressed in their good clothes despite the road. He was a compact, deliberate man in his late 30s with watchful eyes and his grandfather's careful manner of speaking, the kind of economy of word that comes from having said important things before and being disregarded. He read his grandfather's letter, the certified copy that Cora had received from Fitch, with a stillness that was not the absence of feeling but its containment. When he reached the margin note in the clerk's pencil, he read it twice. His grandfather had been in that alley. His grandfather had seen exactly what he said he had seen and had gone to the county clerk with it and been written off in a margin with 4 words. Here was the letter still, and here was what it had spent 16 years waiting to be believed. Cora had sent a telegram to the Territorial Land Office in Topeka, and the superintendent of claims had sent a reply stating that a deputy would be dispatched. His name was Aldrin Poole, and he arrived on the 8th day, a spare man with a satchel and a practiced air of mild official disbelief that collapsed entirely when Cora laid the receipts out in sequence on the floor of the rear room, ordered by date with the director's letter at the end of the row, and explained without haste what each document was and where it had been found. Poole read each document twice. He lifted the iron box and examined its construction. He looked at the opened alcove in the north wall for a long time without speaking. He asked Cora twice how she had known to look. She told him her father had been a stonemason and had taught her to read a wall. The process that followed was composed of paperwork, sworn affidavits, interoffice correspondence, depositions, and the grinding passage of institutional time. And it would not make for dramatic telling, even if every detail of it were known. It is the kind of process that does not announce itself and does not arrive quickly, but it is the kind that lasts. The Territorial Land Office in Topeka opened a formal inquiry under the authority of the Territorial Claims Act. The Western Claims and Settlement Company had dissolved in 1879, but its successor entity, a Kansas City holding company that had absorbed its assets and liabilities without particular attention to the latter, was not beyond the reach of territorial law. The director's letter, with its careful 3rd paragraph about deed transfers, managed at the company's discretion, made the original intent of the collection sufficiently plain to satisfy the inquiry's evidentiary standard. Counsel was engaged. The inquiry ran for 7 months. Tomas Mares submitted a sworn written affidavit on behalf of his grandfather's witness account and the manner in which it had been dismissed. He did not come to Topeka in person, but his words arrived in the formal record with his grandfather's letter attached, and the margin note arrived with them, and together they said what they had always said, that a man had watched from an alley and told the truth and been called unreliable by someone with a reason to call him that. Cordelia Farrow, who was 81 years old and had spent 63 of them watching the land her family had paid for remain in someone else's possession, came to Arroyo Plata in November to give her testimony to the deputy. She came by stage from Liberal, a journey that required 2 days in each direction, and she made it without complaint. She was a small woman with white hair and the careful gait of someone whose bones had learned to be cautious, and she sat in Addie Crane's store and answered every question the deputy asked her in a voice that was precise and unhurried. When the formal portion was done, she remained for a cup of tea that Addie poured without asking, and she said almost nothing further. When she left, she pressed Cora's hand once with both of her own, and Cora understood what the gesture meant because there was no other thing it could mean. The $41 in coins from the Strongbox, along with a substantially larger sum ordered by the territorial court from the successor entity as partial restitution, was distributed in proportional shares to the 37 families, or to their documented heirs where the original claimants had died. The process of locating heirs took several months longer than the inquiry itself. Not all families could be found. 6 parcels had no surviving claimant that the land office's investigators could identify after diligent effort. For those 6, the court designated the proportional sum to a small county fund for the support of a public school, on the reasoning that land stolen from families who had come west to build something ought at minimum to become something in their memory. The Western Claims and Settlement Company's agent, Clarence Oft, had died in 1881 of a fever in Missouri. The director, who had written the letter in 1870, was in his mid-80s and living with a daughter in Ohio, and beyond the court's practical reach by that measure and others. The Kansas City bank account in Ellis Galt's name had been drawn down and closed in 1873, the same year Marshal DeVere had come through Arroyo Plata and found nothing and called the box a myth. None of these facts diminished what the document said. The inquiry's formal finding, published in the Territorial Recorder's Report for 1888, stated that the homesteaders of the Cimarron claims had paid in full for land they were deliberately denied, that the fraud had been systematic and institutional in its design, and that the evidence recovered from Arroyo Plata was sufficient to establish both these conclusions beyond reasonable question. Cora read the published finding in Fitch's office, where she had gone to file updated deed documents for the building. She read it standing at the counter and handed it back to Fitch when she finished. He looked at her over the rims of his spectacles. "What do you intend to do with the building?" he said. "Repair it," she said. He said that seemed like considerable work for a structure not everyone believed was sound. She told him the stonework was sound. She had checked it herself. The work was in the interior fixtures and the drainage and the window seats, none of which were beyond repair if approached correctly and in the right order. He wrote something in his ledger and did not comment further. The winter she spent in Arroyo Plata was a cold one. She mortared the alcove closed again, not because she wished to hide what had been there, but because a sealed wall was a sound wall, and a sound wall was better than an open gap, and this was what she had been taught. She repointed the exterior joints on the north and east faces, where the original mortar had cracked through, replaced 2 sills that had fractured along their vertical joints, and cleared 3 decades of debris from the foundation drainage channels so that the spring melt would not run under the building and compromise the lower courses from within. She bartered her labor on 2 neighboring properties in exchange for lime and sand, and she learned the names of the families who lived in them, and she ate supper with Addie Crane on Thursday evenings through November and December, and into January. By February, the rear room had a new window fitted with salvaged glass in a remortared stone sill, and the 2 front windows had been properly reseated in fresh mortar beds rather than the failed original setting that had let water travel down the interior face. The building was not yet what it would eventually become, but it was no longer failing. It was in the condition her father had a name for, which was arrested, meaning it had stopped getting worse and could now begin the slower process of getting better. Tomas Mares came back in the spring when the roads had dried. He brought his grandfather's letter with him, the original, which had been returned to the family by the land office after the inquiry closed. He asked if he could see the alcove. Cora took him through the front room and the rear room and showed him the north wall, repaired and sound, the courses continuous and level, the joints fresh and wide against the ochre stone. He stood in front of it for a moment and put his hand flat against the stone. He saw it go in, Tomas said. Yes, Cora said, and nobody believed him for 16 years. She thought about this. A pencil note in a margin is not a verdict, she said. Your grandfather told the truth. He told it to the right office and in the right form and at the right time. What failed him was not the evidence. What he needed was someone who could go back to the stone itself. She paused. The stone held it until someone came who could hear it. Thomas Mares was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. He left that afternoon. Before he went, he paused in the doorway of the front room and looked back at the gray timber bar and the repaired walls and the afternoon light coming through the new glass. And his expression was not triumphant, and it was not sad, and it was not grateful in any theatrical way. It was the expression of a man who has seen a thing resolved that he had not expected to see resolved in his lifetime. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The building in Arroyo Plata still stands. The sandstone is ochre and warm in the afternoon light, cut true and set with the precision of a craftsman who believed that what you built correctly would outlast you. And so it has. The north wall of the rear room is unremarkable from the inside, a flat face of mortared stone with no visible break in the courses, the same as any other wall in the building. You would not look at it twice unless someone had taught you what a wall could hold. Have you ever come across something dismissed and overlooked that turned out to hold more truth than the people in charge wanted anyone to find? Leave a thought below. Some stories deserve to be heard more than once. Her name does not appear in the Territorial Recorder's report for 1888, not as discoverer, not as witness, not in any role that the formal record found worth noting. She appears only in the property deed, $2, and in the invoice she filed with the county for repointing work done on the exterior of the building adjacent to the recorder's office. 4 days' labor at the standard mason's rate, paid in full within the week. The restitution went to the families who were owed it. The building that had held the proof belonged to her by purchase and by the work she had put into it, and she had no expectation of any other compensation and would not have accepted it. She had not come to Arroyo Plata to profit from what the wall held. She had come looking for a working situation, and she had found one. And she had worked. Her father's chisels were in the same condition when she finished the wall as when she started it, bright where they met material, and dark with oil everywhere else. She cleaned them the way she had cleaned them every day of her working life, each blade in turn, wiped and oiled and wrapped in the oilcloth he had used for them. She put them back in the flat case he had made for them from cedar, a case with a fitted slot for each chisel, and a clasp she had repaired herself the year before his death. She closed the clasp. The tools were ready, as he had always taught her they should be, for whatever the next wall had to say. If there is another story like this one waiting, you already know where to find it.